right, thanks for joining us here with Andre Frattino, Kate Kasenow. Did I get that correct?
Exactly correct.
I may have put the accent in the wrong spot. Your new book is Happy Book Birthday, by the way.
Thank you.
Tokyo Rose 0 Hour. So I'm a little, being somewhat of a Japanophile and having lived in Japan for a couple of years and just being loving history. I knew the name, but I knew nothing about the person. What attracted the two of you to the story, to this character that people know the name of, but probably don't know anything about? What attracted you to the story?
Well, that was my first experience too. I kind of knew the general name of Tokyo Rose and the baggage that came with that, but I had no idea about kind of like the real people behind it. And Andre was actually the one to bring it to my attention.
Yeah, I grew up being a pretty big World War II buff, and my grandfather fought in the Pacific Theater. And, you know, he had told me a little bit about his experiences, but a lot of what I initially learned was from watching old World War II movies, the old black and white ones from the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And whenever they would do something set in the Pacific, usually, you know, there would be some experience with Tokyo Rose in the script. It would be ever so slightly, but it would be like, you know, the GIs would be listening to a radio broadcast and you would hear this just perfect, like accentless, you know, English voice that would come on the radio. And I was always like, wow, this is supposed to be the enemy. I don't understand why. And as I got older, I started to learn, you know, more about the specific part of history and what Tokyo Rose really was and where she came from and everything. And so, you know, once I read that Iva Toguri was the one that was saddled with the actual title of Tokyo Rose and kind of cemented into her existence, the experiences that she went through as a Japanese American stuck in Japan, you know, forced to live in, you know, Tokyo through the traumatic years of World War II. It just was a story that kind of came right off the history pages.
So that's a big view of the story. Let's break down the story just a little bit so people can have an idea about the questions I'm going to dig into in a second. So Tokyo Rose, was she one person or was she an entity? What was she? So what was her purpose?
So the Japanese propaganda department was put in charge of trying to come up with ways to demoralize the Allied troops in the Pacific. And they had tried a lot of different things, some that were obviously didn't work from the go, and then some that were comical in hindsight. But they eventually came up with this idea of doing radio broadcasts that would have kind of a demoralizing lean-to, featuring American and Canadian voice actors who were mostly Asian Canadian or Asian American. And at one point, I think there was like 5 or 6 of them, could have been more. But their whole point was to just kind of do like sing-song, slightly kind of flirty radio broadcasts. And in charge of the department was Allied POWs who were meant to essentially manage and operate the broadcasts. And Charles Cousin, who was an Australian officer who, before he became an officer in the war, actually was a disc jockey in Australia. He was the one that kind of came up with the idea of like, well, if we're going to do this, we're going to sabotage it from within. And, you know, he didn't want some beautiful starlit sing-song voice, you know, radio propagandist. He went after Iva because of so many other different unique factors, including that her voice was kind of like a little different from most. And Iva, being a very avid, you know, American patriot, was very much about, you know, helping the Allied cause from within. And so that's actually how Orphan Anne got started, which is what Iva went by. But when the war ended, you know, Tokyo Rose was the moniker that was given to all of them. You know, nobody could tell who was Iva Toguri, who was Tokyo Rose, who was Orphan Anne, who was any of the other people there. And Iva, you know, answered a call from the Cosmopolitan, from Kasenow, actually, the magazine. And they got an exclusive interview with her. And from there on out, Tokyo Rose became synonymous with her.
Wow. And Iva Toguri spent five years in prison, in American prison, yes?
I think it was closer to 10, actually, yes.
Wow. until she was pardoned in the late 70s by Gerald Ford, I think. Yeah?
Well, she was actually pardoned beforehand on good behavior, and she returned to the state. She returned with her family to Chicago. They had moved to Chicago after the internment. And it was years later in the 70s that she was pardoned. And actually the person who helped pardon her was the son of the lawyer that helped to try and defend her in the civil case that took place in the 40s. And they were able to get in front of, Gerald Ford's desk, and he pardoned her in the 70s. And she went on to live the rest of her life, for the most part. Well, I'm not going to say anything.
No spoilers.
Don't bury the lead, man. Don't bury the lead. So having read the graphic novel, it's what I liked about it is I like nonfiction, and it's this sounds very cliche, but I like nonfiction that's historical and real, but also doesn't sugarcoat it. Mm-hmm. And your graphic novel doesn't sugarcoat it, because it says that there were some hard times that she experienced after the war, but also that she assisted with in the POWs that were there in the 40s. How did you research all this? Were there sources that you could still contact, or was it all just reading and lots of trips to the internet?
It was mostly what I could find in nonfiction and factual documentation. I didn't get a chance to really interview anybody who knew her or was there at the experiences. So probably in total, there was about half a dozen books I could find on Iva Toguri and the case of Tokyo Rose. And all of them, some of them were self-published books. Some of them were, traditional. Some of them came from documented, US forms. But for the most part, there wasn't a whole heck of a lot out there. And I had to say that a lot of what you see on, Wikipedia isn't really far off from what is actually available to read about for Iva Toguri.
You touched on something, and if you look at the book's blurb on Amazon, it says Tokyo Rose, the phenomenon, and that's an interesting bit, because I'm like, what is the phenomenon? I guess I'm going to say it's because people know the name Tokyo Rose, but they don't know what happened or what the story is, or if it's a moniker, or if it's a real person or whatnot.
Yeah, I feel like most people are kind of just coming at it like, that sounds like a figure I've heard about, but I don't know, I don't know anything about it. So since it was assigned to so many people and there was so much confusion during that time, a lot of people, I think, are approaching it from the same perspective that you are, like, wait, who? So this is like the real one, the real story. Like, am I getting? And in the book, I mean, we make that point too. We never say specifically that Iva is Tokyo Rose. We show how it was kind of a shared title and how that affected a lot of different people.
In your book, when you have Iva hanging out with the other 4 or 5 ladies who were the voice of Zero Hour, who were the voice of the national of the Japanese broadcasting system. It's neat to see the 5 of them or the 6 of them hanging out. Just surreal. But I mean, that's war and that's propaganda, and it's just a confusing time, isn't it?
Yeah, it brings a lot of people together in circumstances they never thought that they would be in.
Well, in researching the book and for this interview, I went online on our friend YouTube, sometimes our friend, just to see if there were if there was real footage of Iva Toguri out there broadcasting. Mm-hmm. And have you done a search for this to see if that was real?
I'm assuming, did you see the recording that was taken after the fact, where she kind of like walks through how the program was done? Because there's a YouTube video where it was actually recorded after the war was over, mm-hmm. and people wanted to know, like, well, how did you do these broadcasts? And it was like filmed in 48 or 49, I think, before she was arrested. Mm-hmm. And it's just almost kind of like a how-to, like, this is how we did it. And then, they did an actual little mock video of her doing her broadcast. It's really in bad shape, but like, you essentially get the gist of, what it meant to her and what she was promoting and how it was really done.
I think that is the same one I saw, because it had her doing an intro and an outro, and then a news guy came in and said, "You Yankee Devils will die on Iwo Jima," or something like that. But it was filmed in two angles, so that mm-hmm. must be the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you listen, I mean, presuming that her dialogue from that was similar to what she did in real time in the 40s, hearing it now, it almost sounds like an SNL sketch.
Yeah.
Like a little bit of comedy. There's some sexual innuendo there.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of stuff that in hindsight just seems odd. How do you think, because I mean, it's all kind of speculative, isn't it? But how do you think, and your grandfather served and heard her broadcasts. Did I remember that correctly?
Yeah, he never talked about her, and he actually never mentioned her. But I mean, he was at Pearl Harbor when it was bombed. He was at Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Midway, Guadalcanal. He was a 1st Division Marine, so I'm sure he heard her. I mean, she became a phenomenon across the American Allied forces. She became essentially like an urban legend / folk hero. Yeah. That some people thought of it as funny. Some people thought of it as, engaging. Some people kind of probably got, riled up from it and thought we'll show her. But, I think that if you really look at any other broadcasts of the 40s, even in America, what was it? Frank Sinatra used to sell toothpaste between skits when he would do things. Yeah. So it's not really all that awkward then. I mean, we'd look at anything today and laugh at how the media portrayed things back in the 40s. In the 50s and 60s, I think they did a PSA where they talked about how, comics rotted kids' brains. And it showed a bunch of kids in black and white, in the woods, suddenly reading comics and then walking around slapping rocks against the wall and hitting things with trees like they had become some kind of monsters. So
hooligans.
Yeah. And so, I think that it was probably spot on for the times. And more than anything, those slight innuendos were meant to rile the troops up. But in the end, it really just, I think it did the adverse effect. I think it really it was their entertainment more than anything. Yeah.
Also, the graphic novel does a good job of illustrating that and demonstrating the Japanese desire for propaganda, but also really effectively showing, I believe it's the Australian DJ you spoke about, who was producing the show, who was like, you know what, we're going to make this, but we're going to make it just a little bit subversive, to where those troops who are out there who are thinking may say, okay, this lady's not really 100% on the Axis side.
Well, it just shows those kind of different perspectives that each of these opposing sides had of one another. The Japanese are obviously looking at propaganda very differently than the way Americans were looking at propaganda, which is very different from the way that the Australians and French and whoever else might have been looking at their propaganda. There's so many cultural differences at play that it was probably, conceivably very easy for them to use that almost against one another without, having to say anything explicit.
Yeah, I mean, you laugh today and think there's no way this would happen now, but I mean, we're a far more connected world than we were, in the 40s. I mean, now we can look up on the internet and, we can learn a lot more. And, Japanese culture has become a lot more trend setting in the 80s onto today with Pokemon and Dragon Ball Z and, other forms of entertainment. So we have a much stronger understanding of, Asian culture and they of us and the Western culture than we did back then. Back then, it wasn't to say that there weren't people who had been to America. In fact, some of the people who worked as officers in the Japanese military and intelligence had gone to Harvard and Yale and had known of the U.S., but to then have to go back and try and explain that to their fellow officers who had never had experience. This is
what you ended up with. It's a game of telephone.
Exactly.
It keeps getting filtered down through different people, and and it becomes very difficult for any one person to say, what the honest, just straightforward fact was.
What is the truth? So the book started out as a Kickstarter, didn't it? And it grew into a book that was published on Tuttle. How does it go from Kickstarter to Tuttle? How does that happen as creators, as writers and artists? What happened there?
Well, I mean, we always initially thought of it being a Kickstarter first, because Andre had just successfully kickstarted another book, Simon Says. And so he had a lot of experience with that fundraising media, and he was like, we can make this work the same way for our book, which is, in a similar enough vein of that sort of that period in history. So he had a lot of experience and brought me into the project. And we were very fortunate enough to be able to really sell this idea to so many other people that believed in it, you know, to get the book made in the first place. And we thought, you know, we did a beautiful job putting it together ourselves, but at the end of the day, we were like, we can get this in front of more people if we potentially bring a publisher on to spread the word, you know, because they have just a broader range of influence than we do. They have printers and sellers and buyers in every, you know, in every corner of the country and maybe other countries. And so we were like, if we can get a publisher that will help us with this, that's only going to help us share Iva's story with more people. Right.
And, you know, I think Kickstarters is, doing anything through crowdfunding or kickstarting helps the show analytics that, like, look, there is an audience for this. People do want it. You know, I venture to believe that part of what Image took Simon Says was they were able to see, like, yeah, they got funded. You know, they had over 400 people buy in 30 days, you know, for that project. Right. So that's, exactly. So when they saw that, you know, I was hoping that that was going to be another avenue that we could use to further advertise our project to publishers and say, look, you know, there is a market, there is an audience for it.
And you actually found Tuttle for us as like a really nice home for this particular story.
Yeah, we tried a few different publishers, and, you know, I think that, you know, it just wasn't really, I don't know, we just never found any publishing from the traditional graphic novel sense. And that just happens when, I think mostly because right around the same time we were pushing for this, George Takei's They Call This Enemy had come out. There's also been a number of, in the past 4 or 5 years, a lot of graphic novels focusing on the internment camps in the US. And so I think we might have gotten a little lost in the shuffle with major publishers in the graphic novel spectrum. But it was just such a, I think it was perfect because in the end, Tuttle is a 75-year-old publisher that actually got started in Japan by Charles Tuttle, who was, you know, part of General MacArthur's staff. And MacArthur had put him in charge of rejuvenating the Japanese publishing industry. So, you know, and with all the GIs stationed in Japan and in the Southeast Asia, they needed to produce books that, you know, they could read over there. So, you know, it's kind of just a perfect home for it because I'm sure that while Tuttle was over there rejuvenating the press that would eventually become Tuttle, you know, I was still running around trying to find her way home. So it's kind of a nice thought to be like, it's kind of a full circle connector.
That's cool. The illustrations, Kate, how did these illustrations drawing a real person and a real life story, how did that differ, or was it always in your wheelhouse for illustration wise?
I mean, the book that I had worked on just prior to this was also like an autobiographical sort of thing, or well, I guess biographical, but I never can remember what the difference is. Anyway.
Autobiographical would be like if he was doing, well, I guess.
Like he wrote it. Yeah, he wrote it. So it was he wrote his own like autobiography as a comic, and then I was the illustrator on that. And we had worked on a project previously, so I knew him, right? But I still am illustrating like events from his life, people he knew. So it was something that I was vaguely familiar with. But in this story we're dealing with, it takes place in the past. So there was a lot of just base historical research about, you know, people in Japan at that time, architecture in Japan at that time, fashion in America and Japan at that time. And that in itself like presented another challenge because as we've been talking about historically, this time period for the Japanese, it was pretty difficult to access from an outside perspective. And there are not a lot of remaining records that are like super reliable. So there were many bad Google searches. There was a lot of digging in, you know, digging past sort of the superficial layers of what people thought that time period was like and trying to find, you know, actual images to base it off of. I was fortunate enough to go to Tokyo and spend some time there many years ago. So I kind of had also my own like pictures of the, you know, the city to kind of form a basis of like, you know, what the architecture might have looked like when I went to historical districts and looked around and snapped photos. So that was really fortunate for me to have as a base of research as well. But yeah, I mean, ultimately it just came down to the same visual research that I put into any project, like looking around for what the, you know, the most accurate sources that I can find. Andre was nice enough to provide a lot of reference as well that he had come up with in his like writing research as well, which was really helpful.
As a book, I have my own opinion on this, but who do you think the audience, the entry audience, and who it's going to demo through. Like I think that, I don't want to bias my answer. Who do you think would who do you think is going to be the earliest age to latch onto the book, and who's it going to be key for?
I think it's going to be a good maybe middle grade reader. I mean, think about what I work on when I think about writing is I never try to age it specifically. You know, like what Simon says, it's very obviously an adult graphic novel about Nazi hunters and, you know, post World War II, Cold War, you know, tragedy and trauma. But, you know, with my other graphic novels that I used to do, they were focused on ghost and folklore, and they were kind of actiony and campy. And with this book and with other projects I've worked on, like the Jim Henson Shapeshifters, you know, I try to write that is a point where everyone can jump on, you know, whether you're young or old or new in comics or somebody who's like well versed in them. But I think that when the idea of like what would be the grade level that could read this, I think 7th or 8th grade could handle it. You know, there's a couple of things in here that Kate and I have talked back and forth, like what would that be perceived as? But all in all, I don't think there's anything terrible in here that would be hard for a kid to understand.
Yeah, there's pretty specifically, you know, we didn't make it like very explicit in a lot of ways that people associate with that term. You know, we wanted to make, the whole goal of this story was to share it with as many people as possible, you know, whether they are like young adults or like full grown, you know, older adults. We wanted everyone to be able to approach this story and take something away from it. So I think that just that level of accessibility was really key to us early on. And I think we achieved that really well. I think, you know, at our signing yesterday, we had quite a few younger women, you know, pick up this story and kids and take that home to sort of read later, which was really encouraging to me because, like, I mean, some of the ideas in this book, like I said, we didn't have anything that was visually or like, you know, written as in a really explicit way, but the ideas of the story can be a little challenging for some people, you know.
It's a little deep in for some students. I will say this, our 7th grader read the book and liked it. He has base knowledge of World War II. Mm-hmm. He's digging into, I think in 7th grade, they start doing the finer aspects of it, the more complex issues, but he was able to follow and understand the story. So that's the 7th grade view.
Yeah, and that's exactly like what we set out to do. Because again, I mean, it's Iva's story, and we wanted to share it. Because when Andre approached me with this project initially, like we were talking about, like I knew the name Tokyo Rose, but didn't know anything about the real person. And when I learned about what actually happened to her, what actually happened to her family, it's like, this is really important. Yeah. And, you know, we need to help get this story out there, because at the time, I mean, there are lots of stories about this time in history and about the effect that it has had on a lot of Japanese, you know, and Japanese American communities. Yeah. But like, we felt that this story just hadn't, you know, no one was sharing this story in particular. And this was, you know, our angle into that time period and how we could help with this effort to uncover the history of this time.
And Andre, I share your opinion about the book possibly maybe getting lost in the shuffle a couple of years ago, and in that, because we received a couple of those books here, and they all were not equal. A lot of them kind of had their content was muddled in some parts, but yours is pretty cool. It's very clear, and it's obviously just straight historical and enjoyable.
Thank you. So, yeah, I don't think there wasn't any need to really embellish what Iva had gone through. I mean, everything that's written is like, well, there you go. That's a piece of the story that has to happen. So yeah.
It's a fascinating, stranger than life story to those that don't know it, which is a lot of people. I didn't know it, and I'm a, you know, midlife life dude.
I mean, we've been over the past few days talking to a lot of people that didn't really know it too, and every time someone hears it, they have pretty much the same reaction I did, like, what?
Wasn't she a traitor?
Really, yeah. And you get some people who already do have opinions, like, no, she was like a traitor, and you get other people like, well, it's not so simple, and you know, that conversation is also like an important one, I think, for people to have.
That's a conversation that maybe those upper middle school and those high school kids, those classes would love having that when they get their hands on the book. Mm-hmm. Hey, just 2 more questions. It's in the video, I think that we saw the same video of what was Iva Toguri speaking, reenacting. When she signed out, she often said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Mm-hmm. Have you ever drawn that parallel to Gomer Pyle? And this side tangential weird question. You have to know Gomer Pyle and what he would say, but then were the two ever connected? And I don't mean like historically. Yeah. I mean, did Gomer Pyle riff that from?
I don't know. It's possible. I think Gomer Pyle came later, if I'm not wrong.
You're correct. Late 60s.
So, yeah, so it could have been. I mean, the other thing is there's not a lot of recorded documents of her other broadcasts. So it might have been just that one. It might have been a one-off. That might have been a constant thing she did, and maybe, you know, Gomer Pyle's character was based off of that later. That's a really nice thing that you picked up on. But I honestly don't know that answer. That's an interesting, intriguing idea.
The joy of propaganda is how well and easily it spreads without, you know, really being intentional in a lot of ways. Just how, you know, just the shareability of it, the you know, the interesting angles that are presented through it, you know, allows for it to sort of keep on even long after some of these figures are gone. I'm
just trying to start some silly internet rumor. That's all. Lastly, Andre, you mentioned a comic book that I were like, the Storytellers series from Archaea, I love. Shapeshifters, I haven't followed. What can you tell? Because we do a lot with all age comic books. Every week we do what's new in all age comic books, blah, 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 blah. What can you tell us about this series, and who is it going to be good for? And what is it? Because I talk about it all the time on the podcast, but how do you view it?
The Shapeshifters is an anthology series in collaboration with Archaea Boom Studios and Jim Henson Company. The collected edition will come out in November, so you'll be able to get all 4 of the issues that come out over the first 4 months. Yeah. So, you know, and then this issue or this series this year, because they always do it annually, and they release between February and May, you know, this one's about shapeshifters in mythology and history or in folklore. And so not to give away too much of it because everybody picks some different stories. But, you know, I focused on the story of the Children of Lear, which is famous for an Irish culture. And, you know, it's about 3 children essentially of royalty that are, you know, misled and then transformed into swans and have to essentially work together to, you know, break the curse. So that was a lot of fun. I worked with Nori Rutherford on that. She has some beautiful artwork, very, very fitting for the Jim Henson brand. And she captured John Hurt's likeness very well in the story. And so awesome. That was a lot of fun, was to be able to put voice to, you know, a character that John Hurt had created. And, you know, to see that visually on there was like, wow, this is great.
Yeah, there are some publishers, whenever anything comes out from them, we just kind of pay attention to it. The Storytellers imprint and Archaea, it's almost like anything that comes to Archaea that is the Storytellers, we immediately pay attention to, because historically, this one we haven't, disclosure, but the previous 2 or 3 we have. We don't have the graphic novels, but we've gotten the comic books that are somewhere in the closet. We read them.
Yeah, there's some other great ones in there too from some other amazing artists.
Witches was great.
Yeah, yeah. So definitely pick this one up. I think you'll be very pleasantly happy with how all the stories for the Storyteller series turned out.
Outstanding. So we got Tokyo Rose 0 Hour. It's available now. How could you best encapsulate this for students who are on the fence about reading a nonfiction graphic novel? How could you do that?
Do you have that, or? I think that for anybody who loves graphic novels, whether it be fictional or nonfiction, it's important to know that real heroes exist in the universe, and they don't wear capes, and whether they see themselves as heroes or not, they can do pretty heroic and amazing and courageous things. And I think that not to let the nonfiction, you know, title make them think it's a yawn fest. There's a lot of action and adventure. And I think that many of them will see themselves in Iva Toguri.
Yeah, it's a story of perseverance, of like personal strength in the face of crazy circumstances that really happen. So if that's the kind of story that you get behind when it's in a fantasy setting, I think you'll enjoy this just as much, even though it really happened and it happened in the craziest way possible.